And stop at any time with questions then. And all of this material should be relatively familiar, should be familiar to all of our new agents. Sorry, all of our seasoned agents. And then brand new for our new licensees. But we just thought it would be a good idea to kind of go back over the NIR changes from August. So, for our new agents, these are the forms that you have always been practicing on. So this is a revision that happened in August. So for our seasoned agents, this is new for them, not so new anymore. For our new agents, this is the way you've always been practicing. So if you are brand new since August 1st, this is the way that you've always been practicing, as I said. So, okay, so we're going over the listing contract, the buyer agency, the offer to purchase, the compensation agreement, and the pre-agency showing agreement today. And helpful reminders before diving in. So, what was really helpful to me after all of these changes took effect in August, mid-August, I should say, was that most of what we know already in terms of agency laws, the concept of a consumer, the concept of a customer versus a client, that all remained the same. And actually, I was doing some research for the team meeting topic for tomorrow, and I saw a 2016 WRA article on all of the different ways that a firm can collect a commission. And I'll repeat of what I'm going to go over today. But just like a helpful reminder, like this, the way that we practice now has always been the case. It's just the norms of a listing firm paying for the buyer's firm's commission kind of took precedence. So anyway, I don't want to get too weedy, sorry. So what's new is the use of the pre-agency showing agreement and the omission of the MLS compensation fields in MLS are technically the only practice changes. Everything else has remained the same. Okay, so first up, the pre-agency showing agreement. So this is a new form for us, again, since mid-August. You will be using this form upon first meeting a buyer consumer. So this is the form that you would use prior to establishing whether or not this buyer is going to become a client or a customer in the transaction. So, excuse me. So I'll go into practice here. So, if you are an agent hosting an open house, you do not need to get this pre-agency agreement in practice. I thought I had a example here of when you would most likely be using it. But like a Zillow lead, for example. So a Zillow lead comes in, you have not yet had an opportunity to go and have a buyer consultation with this Zillow lead. And at the same rate, you probably haven't had a chance to discuss the concept of what a customer is in a transaction. So this would be the perfect form that you would use for that buyer lead. Ideally, you are using this pre-agency showing agreement only for a short time before, again, entering into a buyer agency agreement or establishing them as a customer. So again, for any lead or referral you receive prior to entering into a buyer agency agreement, think of this dating stage. So again, you guys are just kind of getting to know each other. You're determining whether or not you want to take them on as a buyer client. They're trying to determine whether or not they want to use you as an agent. So again, you would need that form during this period. You do not need a form for each home. You only need one of these agreements to be executed, And this covers everything that you show them. Once you enter into negotiations, so that's most often triggered by the discussion of an offer, then either the WRA disclosure to customer must be signed or a buyer agency agreement must be signed. So you cannot write an offer without establishing that customer or client relationship, which again has always been the case. So let me go back to the pre-agency agreement. I highlighted or only just cut the bulk of what the agreement says. The top half of this is just informational, or I'm sorry, excuse me, data about the agent and data collection for the buyer. But the undersigned prospective buyer and the firm hereby enter into this pre-agency showing agreement on the following terms and conditions. This is not an agency agreement. This agreement does not authorize an agent to draft an offer to purchase. So it says it right there in bold. And then I want to skip to lines 44 to 46. I got the question the other day about whether or not we could just strike this line. One of our agents felt it might be, I don't know, too intimidating for a buyer to sign this if they saw that there was compensation lines. And please, by all means, go ahead and strike this altogether if you feel the same way. But 9 times out of 10, you are not going to be charging a buyer consumer to show a home. Again, kind of going back to that dating stage, you're trying to feel them out. They're trying to feel you out and you're trying to win their business. And then it's per the terms of that buyer agency contract that you would be paid ultimately under. So it might be kind of the case where there might be a scenario where you might want to charge a buyer, maybe you're working with an investor who wants to, see a lot of homes, then it might be appropriate, but I think ultimately you would not be charging a buyer compensation just to show them homes, but it allows for it here. So any questions so far about that? Okay, and then as a reminder, again, you'll find this form in your Zip Forms library. It should already come up in our templates when you apply a offer to purchase template. And again, ideally, you're just using this for a few showings and then you're entering right into a buyer agency agreement with that buyer. So again, when is a written agreement with the buyer required before touring a home? So yes, we get this question a lot. If you are a listing agent and you take a sign call, you do not have to sign a pre-agency showing agreement with that buyer under the terms of the listing contract. You are allowed to show that home. Buyer's agent, written agreement before touring, yes. Pre-agency, yes.
Hey, Steph, quick comment or question, maybe a little bit blend of each.
Yes.
I was hosting an open house this Saturday, and semi-informed buyer said, well, what about the whole agreement situation where we're in the home now as an open house? So I just informed him that, the same rule doesn't necessarily apply, that he has to sign something before seeing the open house. But I informed him that if we were to go see another home immediately after, we would have to, follow the subsequent
And that is,
client
yep,
customer rules.
Yep, that's appropriate. Yes. So because you are working, a listing belongs to the firm, not to the agent. So you as a agent of the firm, assuming that you were holding a KW listing open, right? Because you work under the same firm as that listing agent, the same rules apply in terms of not needing that because you work as the listing firm. You're an agent of the listing firm. So you do not need that pre-agency showing agreement. But from there on out, if you are showing him after this open house, then yes, you would need to get the pre-agency showing agreement in place. Or, as you said, enter into a customer relationship, or you could go straight to the buyer agency agreement. So you had it right. Yep.
Thanks for confirming that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I figured that would come up potentially in other open houses as well, either if buyers are hearing about it and concerned about it, or if it needs to be a conversation in the open house.
Right. He is just a very well educated buyer, obviously. I haven't had it come up yet. So
Oh, gotcha.
where a
Gotcha.
buyer was proactive about asking about it. Yeah. So okay, any other questions from anybody else before we move on? Okay. So the next form is the compensation agreement. And this is a firm to firm agreement, which allows the listing firm to compensate the buyer's firm per the listing agreement and sorry, between per the provisions of the listing agreement that we have with our sellers. So if we have a listing agreement that we our total percentage is X, let's say it's 6%, and that seller has approved a compensation to the buyer's agent firm, then we would use this compensation agreement in that case. So and again, this is a firm to firm agreement. This would not need to be signed by either the buyer or the seller. It just needs to be executed by the two firms. And the case where you would use this again, so if I have a listing and I'm charging the seller 6%, that seller has approved a 2.4% commission or compensation to the buyer's agent's firm. Then whoever writes on my listing, I'm going to get this compensation agreement over to them to communicate to them that yes, the listing firm, my listing firm, is going to pay you a 2.4% compensation. And I'm going to get through all of this and we'll discuss the different ways that this can all be spelled out. But ideally that is going to be the case. So again, if I've already committed as the listing firm to paying the buyer's agent's firm the 2.4%, and that's spelled out in my listing contract, then we're going to execute this compensation agreement between the two firms. So starting at line 13, again, I just captured the bulk of the nuts and bolts of the compensation agreement. So the listing firm hereby offers cooperation and compensation in the above referenced transaction involving the property and firm stated above. The listing firm represents and confirms that seller approved the listing firm's offer of compensation stated on lines 19 to 22 to cooperating firms working with buyers, such as the cooperating firm. So here you would cooperation. The cooperating firm accepts the offer of compensation and agrees to cooperate. And then you would strike here on line 17 in what capacity you are working. So whether or not you are a buyer's agent or a sub-agent of the listing firm. So if let's say I'm going to use Mike as an example. If Mike worked for a different company and he was writing as agent of the seller, he would strike buyer's firm to leave that sub-agent of the listing firm open. Or on the flip side, if Mike was working in a buyer agency capacity, he would strike sub-agent of the listing firm to leave buyer's firm open. The compensation offered by the listing firm shall be, and it's going to name it there. I put 2.4% in this example. On line 23, standard of performance, the compensation is earned by the cooperating firm when the cooperating firm, and it gives examples here, drafts the offer that successfully closes or is procuring cause. And then it gives a definitions for procuring cause and successful transaction. Payment deadline. If earned, the listing firm shall pay or have the settlement agent pay the compensation to the cooperating firm at closing. So we'll strike no later than blank business days and leave it at closing, which has always been the case. So again, this is used between different brokerages. I'm also going to state here that Because we don't have an internal form and we have run this by our attorneys, it is acceptable and okay to use a compensation agreement between two agents within the same firm. And that's more or less just to give peace of mind to the other side. So again, using Mike as an example, if Mike works for KW in this example, if Mike writes on my listing, I'm still going to shoot him over this compensation agreement just so that he has peace of mind knowing that, yes, I will be, or the seller will be paying 2.4%. But again, to get in the weeds, really, that's all covered by the terms of the listing contract and that total commission. But again, we just kind of want to spell it out and make sure that it's clear between the buyer's agent and the listing agent that a comp is being offered and that we can leave the commission discussion out of the offer to purchase itself. Okay.
Quick question, Steph. This is
Yes.
Mike,
Okay.
Mike Weber. Would it be accurate to say that it would be ideal to have that compensation agreement come from the listing side before
Yes,
the offer is drafted? Um,
absolutely.
okay.
Yes.
Otherwise, it can be written by the buyer's side.
It can be written by the buyer side, but best practice as a listing agent is if your seller has already approved the 2.4% and I'm using 2.4%, but it could be another number. If the seller has approved the 2.4% in the listing contract, then as a listing agent, my next move is to get a compensation agreement filled out as part of my paperwork that I'm going to supply to the buyer's agent firm. When I catch wind that someone is going to be writing an offer, submitting an offer, then I'm going to get that compensation agreement over to that buyer's agent right away and say, please execute this and send it along with the offer. It's not attached to the offer, but either get it to me before you submit an offer or along with the offer. Does that make sense?
And yes. So you may be getting to this next part, but it's another question. And I think it's probably applicable to others as well, because this come up twice recently for me. But I want to make sure that I am asking from the buyer side. I work mostly with buyers, so I want to make sure that I'm asking the listing agent appropriately whether there's a compensation agreement or if the seller prefers for the compensation or concessions to be written into the offer. Is that an accurate, or I guess the best way of requesting? Because I actually got chewed out by a non KW agent. I will refrain from mentioning the firm's name, but chewed out in detail after I said, the first few words of asking that question. And I didn't feel that I was in the wrong. By the way that I asked it, but I want to understand if there's a best way to ask either or, because that firm ended up having a totally different preference on how the sellers were to communicate that.
Right. And you asked it totally appropriately. And that is a conversation that I would be having with any listing firm, listing agent. And just because, and this is what I want people to hear as well, that, there's multiple ways to come to the same conclusion. And other firms have adopted their own policy. So another big firm in town, for example, they are not, they've got a general policy that they are not offering compensation to the buyer's firm or a sub-agent firm. They are saying, please reflect it in the offer. They're kind of keeping it pretty general and saying seller is offering concessions. But as a buyer's agent, to your point, Mike, that's exactly what I would be asking. You're getting ready to submit an offer. Are you offering compensation or is seller offering concessions? I'm offering compensation. Okay, great. Would you prefer that we execute a compensation agreement, or do you have a compensation agreement that you want to send me, Mr. Listing Agent? Or, and this is another way where it could be a preference versus, none of this is like mandated. It's not black and white. Or, Mr. Listing Agent, would you prefer that I reflect the commission in the offer to purchase? Because that could also be the case. And then same with concessions, which if a seller is not right off the bat offering, a compensation, then you sort of have to play a guessing game and just reflect it right into the offer to purchase. And, again, a conversation with the listing agent. So I'm planning on putting 2.4% in the offer to purchase, Mr. Listing Agent. Is that like, is that what the seller would be expecting?
Steph, it's like you were sitting in on that conversation. Yeah, and I think it's the non-spoken firm you mentioned. So I think it's
Yeah.
just trying to absolutely work with the co-broke as best as possible. Using language that empathizes with them in the hurdle.
Yes.
And I did use that language, and I think it was just a stubborn agent. So thanks for confirming that for me.
Yes, of course. Yeah, and and we kind of don't want to be righteous with it, it's just I think gently reminding like, well, there's more than one way that people in different firms are practicing, so I just need to confirm, I think that's the best way to kind of handle those hard-nosed
Hey,
people.
Steph,
Yes,
uh,
Tammy.
do has anyone been seeing listing agents kind of like when they upfront offer that compensation agreement because they're going to provide a co-broke or buyer agent compensation? Are they kind of being clear too with how some agents will be like, strike this on the offer to purchase, don't put something in this area or whatever? They kind of being specific to don't try to add compensation into the offer to purchase because it'll be redundant. Sort of kind of like already sort of curtail that scenario where it's going to be duplicitous and cause problems to
Yeah.
mitigate it later.
Yeah, so if I'm following correctly, if an agent is supplying a compensation agreement ahead of time, then they're also communicating, don't put it in the offer
Right.
because this is the method that we're gonna address the commission between the
Right.
firms.
Is anyone kind of like gently kind of like pointing out let's not be duplicitous here? This is a
Oh,
compensation agreement.
yes, I think that's good to do that. Like, yes, here's the compensation agreement, and as a reminder, please just leave it
Offer.
out of the offer to purchase. Yes. And I think, some agents in our orbit in KW, I think in their like offer instructions, for example,
Yes.
they'll specifically state, do not write it in lines 543 to 547. Here, please execute this compensation agreement.
And
Yes.
how, yeah. And how are they kind of communicating that? Because that can't be put in the MLS.
I
Are
mean,
they
I think it's just like marketing materials at the house,
at the
and
house? Okay.
yeah, or
Cool.
I mean, it's so rare, I hope. I hope it's so rare that there are not agents who are just submitting offers, buyer's agents just submitting offers without having conversations with the listing firm with the
Hmm.
listing agent first, I mean, that's just poor practice. So, you know, that it would be at that like during that conversation where all of this could get hashed out. But yeah, I mean, I've got agents who are just like they are putting their they're putting directions at the house, these are the offer instructions. So,
Cool.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a great thing too, because you can
Yeah.
just say, hey, we're offering compensation.
Yep.
Let's do this. This is our plan. And then
Exactly.
hopefully there's not a lot of extra back and forth with correcting things on paperwork. So
Totally.
cool.
Yes.
Thanks.
So, okay, so these remaining bullet points we did just go over. But again, best practice if your seller is offering comp, have a pre-filled compensation ready to send to the buyer's agents. And then buyer's agents, if it has been communicated that compensation is being offered, and you don't see one available, send one over to the listing agent to get signed prior to submitting an offer. When all of this first went down, we had so many questions about, okay, well, what happens if we don't get a compensation agreement executed? Then you can absolutely put it into the offer to purchase and clean it up later if need be. But I just sort of feel like now that we've got a couple months under our belt with all of this, it really hasn't been an issue. I do feel like most people are actually just putting it right into the offer to purchase itself, which I'll be showing you those lines shortly.
Yeah, Steph, Kathleen Gill.
I-
Yeah, I am consistently, and sometimes it's because time is of the essence, and we schedule a showing, gets a little bit later, we're gonna write an offer, gotta move quickly.
Yes.
But for the most part, I'm not seeing compensation agreements. And, even though I have communication almost to the fact where I almost missed one once. So I don't know if everyone else is mostly seeing compensation agreements.
I do think that the bulk of way people are practicing are putting it right into the offer.
Yeah.
Again, one is not better than the other. I have my preference. But I just sort of feel like kind of silo it, if there's a compensation being offered, get the compensation agreement executed. But if it goes into the offer, that's okay too. So, okay, any other questions before we move on?
Do you guys, are you going to be covering like what if it's a seller concession and not a percentage?
Yes.
I'm curious to know about that. Thank you.
Okay, so these are the changes, and I'm gonna go back to this. So the compensation disclosure, this should already be to the wayside. This was applicable when we first made changes to the contracts. But everyone should be, enough time has gone past, excuse me, that we should all be using the new forms and we would not need to have this compensation disclosure signed anymore. So I'm not going to go over that. Okay, the listing contract. So the changes to the listing contract and how it reads. So beginning at 21. So this line was always in the listing contract. The firm and its agents may advertise the following concessions, incentives, or special financing offered by the seller. Which are, but this line was added, which are in addition to and separate from compensation to others. So they just want to differentiate and make sure that that's clear that a concession offered by the seller is different from a compensation to the agent, to the buyer's firm, excuse me. Note, concessions offered in the MLS cannot be limited to or conditioned on the retention of or payment to a cooperating firm, buyer's firm, or other buyer's representative. So that is also a new line in the listing contract. So a seller can offer concessions and they may be applied to a buyer's firm to help pay the buyer's firm commission, but they cannot be conditioned upon that. So, technically speaking, when seller is offering concessions, they can be applied a number of different ways. It could be applied to closing costs. It could be applied towards a credit towards replacing carpet. Traditionally, that's what concessions were offered for, for those reasons. Like if you had a older home that, carpet needed to be replaced, like seller would say, you know, I don't want to replace it. I don't want to make that decision for the buyer. How about if I just offer them a credit or a concession to help cover that, right? So traditionally, that's what concessions have been used for. But again, they can be applied to help cover the buyer's firm commission that a buyer's firm is charging that buyer, but we cannot condition it upon that. So like as a listing firm, I can't say, here's $10,000 in concessions. You must use this to pay your buyer's firm. Okay. Compensation to others, line 57. The firm has disclosed and seller approves. This is what's different about the compensation to others line, that word approves. The firm has disclosed and seller approves offers of compensation to cooperating firms working with buyers such as subagents and buyers firms. And then you would name that there. So again, I'll say 2.4% is what you would put there. Then on line 61 to 62, in bold, there is no standard market commission rate. Commissions and types of service may vary by firm. Commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. So just, you know, kind of a CYA statement there. That's the crux of what the settlement was about, what the lawsuit was about, that there was no transparency, that there was price fixing. So again, just a statement here to say commissions are not set and are fully negotiable, which the way that our contracts, the way that the Wisconsin contracts have always been set up for is to allow for negotiation. So, you know, one thing that we have said throughout all of this is just no better place to be than in Wisconsin when all of this went down, just because we were already practicing this way. So like I said, kind of going back to the beginning of the training, not much has changed for us really, in that our contracts have always kind of been set up because we have to fill in the amount here, that it is a negotiable commission and it's not set. So, okay, so I think I've already just said all of this, but, oh yeah, but I will make this point. Concessions are in addition to and separate from compensation to others. So it could very well be the case that a seller is going to compensate or approve a compensation of 2.4% and give a $3,000 credit to the seller, to the buyer for that carpet replacement that I used before. You know, so it's not either or, it could be both. So I just want to make sure that that's clear as well. Because again, traditionally, that's what concessions were used for.
Ask a question, like
Yeah.
how it balances out at the end, you know, when everybody's looking over their final closing disclosures and stuff. Can concessions be allocated however the buyer deems? Like, is it usually, because I haven't had that happen where, you know, it's been allocated toward a real estate agent's compensation. But a buyer can be like, take this portion and put it toward my down payment, take this portion and put it toward real estate fees. I mean, are they able to do that?
Yes, so it would just be, yeah, it would just be directed. And if it's not, so let's say the buyer is receiving $15,000 in concessions. Then, you know, if the buyer wants to take $5,000 of that and apply it towards their buyer's firm's commission, then you would take that and put that in lines 543 to 547. So, and if you just put a $5,000 flat amount, you know, it wouldn't be a percentage, it would just be $5,000. And when we get to the offer, I could show you that.
Yeah.
And then the rest could be a $10,000 closing cost credit where it's being applied towards closing costs. So, and where concessions can get hairy is we always have to go back to the lender to
Yeah,
confirm that there's enough there. So,
like enough wiggle room with what they're allowed to use
right.
from outside sources or something or whatever.
Well, it's
see.
just there's kind of a guideline, like they can only use so much to apply towards closing costs. So that's where it gets really muddy because, you know, kind of going back to the aforementioned uh competitive brokerage in town, um, you know, they're just saying out, you know, they're just expressing, yes, the seller is offering concessions, but they're not naming the amount.
Right.
They're, you know, so they're just basically saying put it in the offer to purchase, you know, so it like I just haven't run into it yet where a lender, or I haven't gotten the question, I should say. I mean, maybe others are running into it and we just haven't heard about it yet. But I have not heard of a case where a lender was like, the seller, the concessions being offered by the seller um is not enough to cover, you know, what the seller or what the buyer wants to use it for. You know what I
Okay.
mean? So,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it very well could come up.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's gotta be a cooperative, they gotta cooperate with the lender and the buyer to determine what can be allocated where
yes.
in the end.
Yes.
Thank you.
So, but again, I just like feel like in practice it really hasn't been an issue, but that's not to say that it won't. Um, so I guess if you're as a buyer's agent out in the world, you know, and the seller is offering concessions, I think you know, the conversation with your buyer at your buyer consultations, you know, you're gonna spell out how all the different ways in which a buyer's firm can be paid. You know, it's by the buyer directly. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself because we're gonna get to the buyer agency in a minute here, and we can talk more about that in just a second. Um, okay, and I've already gone through these bullet points. Okay, so the buyer agency agreement. One second. Okay, that's where I'm gonna get to this. Okay. So the buyer agency agreement, these are the additions to the contract. So line 35 to 36. A firm may not represent that the firm's services are free or available at no cost to their clients unless they will receive no financial compensation from any source for those services. I think this was a reaction to, you know, a lot of buyers, agents out there, like, you know, kind of going over that buying process with their buyers and saying like, oh, you don't pay me, you know, I get paid by the listing firm, or it's free to you. All you have to do is cover your closing costs, like with your lender. You know, they just want to make it clear that, you know, these firm like me working as a buyer agent for somebody, that my services are not free. I actually am being paid somewhere, whether it's by the buyer or most likely by the listing firm or the seller. We just cannot express to our buyers that we're working for free, because that is not the case. Line 50 to 52, the specific amount or rate of compensation must be objectively ascertainable. Compensation may not be open-ended, so we cannot write like a range, like it's, you know, 2.0 to 3.0%. And it must be, again, a flat fee or dollar amount or an hourly rate. But again, the way that we operate, it will be just a specific percentage of the purchase price. I'm not gonna even say what the old example was because it's moot at this point. But again, you're just gonna put that 2.4% or whatever you're charging into the commission lines.
Steph, quick
Um,
question
yes.
on that. I work with investors frequently, and I set a minimum for what my commission will be based on either the percentage or a fixed rate. I've been stating that, you know, for homes under X purchase price, a minimum of X. will be applied. And for homes above that purchase price, 2.4% applies. Similar wording, but it's,
I think that use of the word minimum is where we could get hairy. Hey, Kimmy hasn't kicked this back to you in terms,
no.
have you had an accepted offer yet with that
I've
language?
had two with that, yeah, I had two with that wording, but I don't use minimum. I put in, like, basically it's, you know, for homes below this purchase price, it's X.
Okay, no, I think that's okay then, because you're just spelling out, you're just setting a threshold with the purchase price. So like, or with the
Yeah,
fi-
it's spelled out, but that's why I want to make sure that it's worded appropriately because the buyers understand. But I know it's
if
under
you're not,
increased scrutiny.
yeah, if you're not using the term minimum, like where it's like, because I've seen it, you know, kind of in those lower price points where it would be 2.4%, or this flat fee, whatever is greater, like that is no longer acceptable. So if you're just
Yeah, I've
saying, like,
mixed that language,
yeah,
whichever is greater, and I spell out, you know, the purchase price, basically the threshold, and then I say what it is below that and what it is above that.
okay, I think that's okay. I think that's okay. It's just again where you're kind of like keeping it gray or
Okay.
yeah. So I think that's why it's not getting kicked back. But Kimmy would have kicked it back to you if it was
Yeah, it's been two or three AOs
okay.
with that wording in the buyer agency. So
Okay. No, I think that's fine. Yeah. You're like, this is it, what it is. If this is what the purchase price is, this is what it is if the purchase price is this or more. So, okay. Good question. Okay, the firm cannot receive compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in this agreement. So let's say you are charging the buyer 2% on your buyer agency contract and you show a home that is offering 2.4%. You technically cannot collect that full 2.4% because it exceeds the amount that is agreed to in your buyer agency contract. You can amend your buyer agency agreement, of course. I think a better example would be to say if your buyer agency agreement is 2.4%, and somewhere a listing firm was offering 3%, because that's more likely, you know, it would be kind of an off the wall example like that. You cannot collect that full 3% unless you amend the buyer agency agreement to reflect it for that property. So does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Okay, so if it is the case, like I said, you would make it property specific. So let's say I'm writing on Mike's property and Mike's listing and Mike's seller is offering 3%. Just for that property, I would say, you know, for the accepted offer on or dated such and such a date for property on, you know, 1234 East Main Street, the total commission shall be 3%. But again, that's kind of rare that this is happening, so.
Can I ask something there?
Yeah.
So say the listing agent or the seller is offering 3%. As a way to kind of like make your offer stand out or whatever, you can say that you're only needing 2.4.
You could.
And then they just go back and amend the listing contract, right?
Yes. Yeah, good question. You could absolutely do that as a strategy.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Good questions today, guys. I love it. Okay, so this is where, you know, this is the opportunity for you guys in your buyer consultations, because I know you're all doing them when you're going over the buyer agency agreement. This is your opportunity to kind of spell out how we get paid as a buyer's agent. So the payment by owner or owner's agent. So the firm is hereby authorized to seek payment of commission from the owner or the owner's agent. For example, through the listing firm, such as through a compensation agreement, provided that all parties to the transaction give prior written consent. Buyer shall pay the firm's compensation reduced by any amounts the firm receives from the owner or the owner's agent. Again, there is no standard market rate. Commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. We've already seen this line. Commissions and types of service may vary based on the firm you hire. The firm cannot receive compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in this agreement. So this is where you would, again, as you're kind of describing to an agent or to a buyer how you are collecting your commission, a buyer agency agreement is stating essentially, not essentially, is stating that a buyer is committing to paying that 2.4%. And then 9.9 times out of 10, we as the buyer's agent are collecting that commission from the owner or the owner's agent. So when we collect a commission from the owner, that could be in the form of those concessions. And this is where I would describe what concessions are. So, when we are out seeing homes and, it might be the case where a listing firm is just going to be offering a compensation. Then we already know what they are willing to pay that buyer's firm. It might be the case, again, where we're out and the seller is just offering concessions. So in our offer to purchase, if we learn that they are offering concessions, then we'll just indicate it right in the offer to purchase that we are asking that seller to pay my commission on your behalf. And we'll do that right through the offer to purchase. If it's the other case, then I might just be doing a firm-to-firm compensation agreement. And again, you'll use more, consumer-friendly terms, but, you could say in the other scenario, I could just collect this directly from the listing firm and it will not be put into the offer to purchase. Or you guys, this might be the case. You might run across a listing where neither concessions are being offered nor a compensation is being offered. Then it goes back to the buyer. So, and again, that is already how a buyer agency agreement is set up. That is what is happening. It's a firm to buyer agreement, stating that the buyer will pay the firm's commission unless they are able to collect it through the seller or the owner. Through the seller or through the seller's agent, like the listing firm. Another scenario that might come up, and this happened to me a couple weeks ago. I have a buyer agency agreement for 2.4% with my buyer, and the listing firm was only offering 2% through a compensation agreement. So I took that 2% or compensation agreement and I signed that. And then I asked for the 0.4 difference in the offer to purchase, asking the seller to pay that 0.4 on behalf of my buyer so that I and Keller Williams is collecting the full 2.4%. Let's say that seller countered that out. They ended up agreeing to it, but if that seller countered it out, then I would be going back to the buyer and saying, okay, we made the request, they're not agreeing to it, so the buyer is on the hook for that 0.4 difference, and that's where that's spelled out here. Buyer shall pay the firm's compensation reduced by any amounts the firm receives from the owner or the owner's agent. So I would have been going back to that buyer for that additional 0.4%. So kind of now moving on to, well, we'll get to our flow chart here. Let me see what time it is. Okay, thanks for bearing with me, guys. Hopefully we will end before 1 o'clock. Okay, so the offer to purchase. So here is where that additional language, again, for our new agents, this is always, you've only seen it this way. Any seasoned agents prior to August 15th, this line, seller payment of compensation to buyer's firm, this provision was not in our offers before. But this language could have been written into our offers to purchases prior to all of this. It's just that the WRA recognized that this might be, this provision might be used a lot more, and it has been. So they just crash printed it into the offer to purchase now. So the new language, 543 to 546, seller agrees to pay to buyer's firm the amount of blank percentage or a dollar amount towards the buyer's brokerage fees at closing. Payment under this provision represents an economic adjustment only and does not create any agency relationship between buyer's firm and seller. Parties agree buyer's firm is a direct and intended third party beneficiary of this contract. Don't pay attention to line 545 and 546, that's legalese that they had to put in there. But really the bulk of it is just, again, this is where we're going to indicate that the seller is agreeing to pay the buyer's firm towards the buyer's brokerage fees at closing.
And this is if they're offering concessions and you just want to be clear on where some of it's being allocated?
This is where you would use, yes.
Okay.
So kind of back to your buyer consultation script, you would be telling that buyer, if a seller is offering concessions, you can apply it, elsewhere. But I think the intention is that it would go towards, this is to help offset what you owe me in a buyer through our buyer agency agreement, that 2.4%, for example. So,
Or dollar
I'm
amount.
sorry, say that again.
Or the dollar amount if it's a concession, right? Because it's usually named in
Oh,
dollars.
yes.
So you're just kind of like, this is what's going for buyer brokerage fees specifically in this line.
Yes. Yep. So back to, I guess, kind of how we were, discussing, now that, again, that we've got a couple of months under our belt and how people have really been practicing, I would say, even when a seller is approving an offer of compensation to a buyer's firm, it's still ending up in the offer to purchase. So then, and I can't remember if it was Mike or if it was Tammy, but then in that sense, in that case, if it ends up in the offer to purchase, then we would just reduce the total commission. The listing agent is going to reduce that total commission. And maybe it was Kathleen, who made the comment, but again, it's fine to leave it in the offer to purchase. It's just then that listing agent has to go the extra step and reduce the total commission between the firm and the seller by the amount that's listed here, which is perfectly acceptable too. And I think that's what's mostly been happening, as I had said before. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. So kind of going back to concessions versus compensation. So the reason why concessions now are like even a strategy is because we can advertise it in MLS, and that's really what it is. Concessions again have always been there. It's just now we can mark within the terms, within the data on the MLS, Is seller offering concessions? Yes. And what's kind of funny since all of this has happened, we've learned that MLS won't even allow us to put in what that dollar amount might be. So kind of going back to our carpet example, like now we can't even say $3,000 closing cost credit towards new carpet or concession towards carpet. We can't even identify what that dollar amount is.
That sucks.
I know.
What if it really is toward carpet?
Yeah, so exactly. I know. That's why it's just like kind of funny. So, I think both methods have actually just been proven just fine, to be honest. Like back to that other brokerage who is just like they're rejecting this idea of compensation altogether. So, they're saying sellers offering concessions. So then my question back to them is like, okay, I'm going to put 2.4% in the offer to purchase. Okay. Okay. Like that's just going to be how the conversation is going. I'd like to speak to how in practicality, what's really happening. So again, that's really right now, that's all I can see in terms of how we're practicing is just the small difference between the fact that we can say, yes, concessions are being offered, whereas in compensation, we can't say anything about it at all. Not in the private remarks, that field was completely omitted. But we've seen zero issues with how compensation is being communicated. We've been able to communicate just fine. Our fears about, well, how are we going to communicate it to the buyer's agents that there's a compensation? Well, it just hasn't really been an issue at all. It's just like we have to get on the phone now. But mostly people are just having signs right at their listings. Yes, there is 2.4% compensation being offered. So, okay, compensation agreement versus offer lines. So transaction dependent, there's tons of variables. There is no one way of doing or addressing. I think the best way is to ask the listing agent for the preference, which Mike tried to do in his earlier example and got chewed out still, but yeah, it's just conversations, right? So there might be a preference. Does the total amount communicated from the listing agent match what is in the buyer agency? Okay, so make sure that you are, kind of checking against both. Because you might have to address compensation elsewhere if your buyer agency is different from what is being communicated from the listing agent in terms of comp or concessions. And like I said before, remember that it could be the case that no comp is being offered. So then you're going back to your buyers, and that commitment for you to get paid is within the terms of the buyer agency. And then depending on, as I've already stated, depending on where that compensation or that commission gets addressed, if it's in the offer, listing agents, do we need to amend the listing contract then? So here is a flow chart that I know went out to, I think this should be in our new associate guides now. I'll double check. I mean, it's got to be. I know that Kathleen put it in there. But this is kind of the flow chart that we came up with, that Kathleen Wooten came up with, to kind of help spell out the path of the money. So, if the listing broker agrees to pay the buyer broker, is it in the MLS? No, they can execute a co-broke compensation agreement. This is just reiterating what I've already just said. Listing broker agrees to pay the buyer broker. Is it in the MLS? No. You can then either execute the offer to purchase lines 543 or do that compensation agreement. Then an asterisk here, listing agent may need to consider amending the listing contract to reduce the commission. The seller agrees to pay the buyer concessions. Can we put that in MLS? Yes. So you can either use the offer to purchase lines 543. I didn't address the addendum A in this just because we haven't been seeing it, but traditionally this is the other spot where we would be addressing a credit to a buyer. You would just be using the GMAR addendum A. So back to Tammy's example, let's say there's a buyer who wants to use their concessions in multiple ways. You could use the offer to purchase lines 543 and the GMAR addendum A seller credit lines. Okay.
But
Uh,
if these other agencies are using concessions instead of commission or co-broke compensation, they have to use addendum A, don't they?
Repeat that question.
If a co-broke or if the listing firm who is not Keller Williams, whoever those people are that are offering not
Concession,
compensation agreements but concessions by their seller, they
yes.
do fill that into add A, right? Because it's concession. It's just not specific as to what it's being applied to. It just says it's concessions. I thought add A was always like where you put that.
It is. I think I'm missing something in the question.
Oh,
So if, okay, well, let me break it back to, let's say I am writing as an agent of the seller, and I work for a different company than you do, Tammy, and your seller is offering concessions. If I am writing as an agent of the seller, I have to use the addendum A. I can't use the offer to purchase lines at all.
yeah.
But if your seller is offering concessions, and I know as a buyer's agent that my buyer wants to apply that right to the commission, then I would
Mhm.
use the commission lines on line 543 in the offer.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. Um, okay. Any other questions, you guys?
Thank you, Steph.
Thank you, Tammy. Thanks for
It's a
all your.
lot of good info.
No, you're always great at giving good questions. So I appreciate it when you're on. And anybody else? I sort of feel like, and for my seasoned agents, as you're out practicing, it really hasn't been that much of an issue, right? Hopefully not. Okay. All right. That's all I got, you guys. Thank you.